Welcome everybody to the Candle Enthusiast. This is a spontaneous live video and I am in a very special location today. I tried to take you to as many special locations as I possibly can. And because it's a little windy, I think I'm gonna put my headphones on. Why don't you guys do me a favor? If it gets windy, let me know. I got headphones, bam, I'm gonna put them on. But right now I am in the historic downtown Poughkeepsie, New York, located about 90 miles north of New York City. And I'm on a residential street that has a little bit of history to it, and it pertains to Halloween, you better believe it. If you've seen any of the number of films directed by the legendary Edward D. Wood Jr., or if you've seen the Tim Burton film, it's a biopic made about Edward D. Wood Jr. called Ed Wood, starring Johnny Depp, you'll know the story about the infamous worst director of all time. And hello, everyone joining in. And in this film, and Tim Burton, if you know a little bit about Ed Wood, or if you've seen Tim Burton's film, you'll know that he did grow up in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is very close to where I grew up. So it was always very interesting, you know, when the film in 1994, when Tim Burton's film came out, I was introduced to Ed Wood. I had never seen any of his movies prior to that. But knowing that his stomping grounds was very close to my hometown, and that the movie house that Ed Wood would go to when he was a child was the same movie house that I went to when I was a child. In fact, I took you guys there a couple of years ago on my It's a Wonderful Life video. But you don't want to hear me talk. Just let me know if the sound is okay. If it gets really windy, please, somebody let me know. Just say wind in big caps. So we, again, are in Poughkeepsie, New York. And Edward D. Wood Jr. Was born in the 20s, I believe, early 20s. I'm not sure of his exact birth date. But he was born here in Poughkeepsie, New York. And he lived in a very old house, a house that was actually old for him when he lived there. And if you take a look at these surrounding houses, you'll get an idea. Yeah, some of these are new. This one behind me is definitely not an old house. And when I lived in California, I said to myself, you know what? When I go back to New York, I gotta go see Ed Wood's childhood home. Because even though I grew up near his house, I never actually saw his house. And I actually did a Google Map search when I was in California, and I saw pictures of his house. It was even up for sale. People wanted to purchase the house, fans. They were gonna purchase the house and make an Ed Wood museum. In fact, there's been a lot of attempts in the Hudson Valley to raise money to kind of celebrate Ed Wood, build a statue, build a museum, have an Ed Wood film festival. I tried to be a part of that back about 15 years ago. Tried to get that up and running, but it never quite happened. So when I moved back to California, I wanted to see Ed Wood's house. Ed Wood, again, regarded as the worst movie maker, director of all time. He made horror films, he made science fiction films. He's probably most remembered for the film Plan 9 from Outer Space. Plan 9 from Outer Space is, yes, it's a sight to behold. I don't know if it's the worst movie of all time, but it's certainly pretty bad. Something important to remember about Ed Wood was that he was very close friends with Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi starred in Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula, produced by Universal Studios. It was essentially, other than Nosferatu, the German film, it was essentially the first real adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And during Bela Lugosi, the end of the actor's life, Ed Wood put him Bela Lugosi in a lot of his films, including Plan 9 from Outer Space and Bride of the Monster. You had Orgy of the Dead. I don't know if Bela Lugosi was an Orgy of the Dead. I missed that one. But also, Ed Wood was very experimental, very avant-garde first time. So, if you don't know Ed Wood, definitely look him up and definitely see Tim Burton's film, because easily, in my opinion, Tim Burton's greatest film in every regard is Ed Wood. As many great films as Tim Burton has made, Ed Wood is certainly, I think, his best crowning achievement. And it did win two Oscars. It should have won more, in my opinion. Here's the thing. When I moved back to Poughkeepsie, I tracked down the address. I looked on Google Maps. I could actually see the house on Google Maps. But by the time I got here, his house, that had to have been, if it were still standing, it would have been right here, would be well over 150 years old. Maybe not well over 150 years old, but at least 150 years old. Why they tore down this house, I don't know. I mean, I know why, logistically, because this is an apartment complex and this now serves as a parking lot. But out of all of the houses that could have been taken down, I mean, I'm sure people live in these houses and they love these houses and they all have their own history. This is where Ed Wood's home. His stomping grounds were, this is where Ed Wood would walk down the street using his imagination, dreaming of the future, dreaming of becoming a filmmaker, dreaming of Hollywood, an impossible dream, being in upstate New York, thinking about how am I going to become a filmmaker in New York? How am I going to make it to Hollywood? How am I going to become his idol, who is Orson Welles? His house is really right here. I'm going to put the camera down for a second. His house, right here. Very narrow space, not large at all. Very small, but it was so much history right here. So much cinematic history, and there's more to this story. There's more to this story. Of course, Ed Wood, as a very young child, was hugely inspired by theater and mainly cinema. But where did Ed Wood, he grew up, I think, moderately, well, I don't want to say moderately like poor, but let's say certainly not from a wealthy family. Even back then, I do not think this section of Poughkeepsie was necessarily a wealthy area. But let's take a short little walk. Let me lock my car. I think that might be a wise choice. But if we walk down this street right here, it's a beautiful street here in Poughkeepsie. It's Franklin Avenue. And quite frankly, it reminds me of Haddonfield. Like the Halloween films, right? With all the leaves and the colors. Look at all the leaves on the ground. But I'm going to take you just to the end of this block and I'm going to show you something. Because there is a still standing movie house called the Bardavon. The Bardavon was this majestic theater turned into a movie house, probably during around, a little bit before and during the Depression, and went under dozens and dozens of owners throughout the decades. Most movie houses of that kind of stature usually fall apart. My mom and dad, they grew up in the same town. Their movie house that they went to literally fell to pieces. But this is one of the movie houses that exist in the United States that still stands. Now, I can't take you there right at this moment, but if we walked about 4 blocks in this direction, again, Ed Wood lived right here. If we walked 4 blocks in this direction, we would get to the Bardavon. Now, why is this significant? Well, In 1927, Bela Lugosi, again, the actor who portrayed Dracula in the original American adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, was cast as the actor to play Dracula on let's say a Broadway adaptation of the novel, right, in 1927. And they traveled the country, right? Now, there is no for sure documentation. Any documentation of what I'm about to say is lost at the current moment. But it's said in the Tim Burton film, and it's been said by Ed Wood historians and Bela Lugosi historians that Ed Wood actually saw Bela Lugosi in person with his own eyes for the very first time by seeing Bela Lugosi, before he played Dracula in the film, he saw Dracula, Bela Lugosi playing Dracula at the Bardavon Movie House on Main Street in Poughkeepsie, 3 blocks in that direction. 4 years later, count them, 4 years later, Bela Lugosi would be cast to star as Dracula in the Universal Studios feature film, which is the Dracula that we all know, right? The slicked back hair, the Hungarian / Transylvanian accent, the medallion on the chest, the coattails. I bid you welcome. Well, even though that's kind of in the book. But anyway, so 4 years later, Ed Wood would have gone to the Bardavon to actually see Bela Lugosi on the big screen. So how cool would that have been? Back in 1927, 1931, being young kids, seeing the actual play. And then in 1931, essentially, this is really when talkies, when dialogue, dialogue was added to films. It's late 20s this happened. But he would have seen Bela Lugosi on screen, cementing in his head of Bela Lugosi being this icon of horror, this icon of Gothic literature turned into theater, or I should say adapted into cinema. So again, let's take a quick look of the space where Ed Wood's home was occupied. And I'll be honest, just walking these streets, these sidewalks, I mean, this is where Ed Wood, Johnny Depp, not Johnny Depp. But when I think of Ed Wood, I have to admit, I still think of Ed Wood, or Johnny Depp. I mean, I think it was one of his greatest performances. But right there. Okay, and so to put things in perspective, there's a park down here where I'm certain that's where he would go to play. If he ever owned a bike, he would drive his bike down these streets. I know this might sound a little strange and mundane, but cinematic history, right there, and unfortunately, something lost forever. Something that could have been turned into a museum, something that could have been turned into something very special for film fans, cinema fans, horror fans, science fiction fans, a place for them to pay tribute to a man who maybe never made a great piece of art in his lifetime, very subjective, but he had the heart and the want and the passion to do so. He never gave up. That's the one thing you could say about Ed Wood. He died a very young man, I think at age 56, and he really was horribly depressed, alcoholic by the time he was sick and passed away. But the one thing you could say is he never gave up his art form. He never gave up, and he never had a success in all of his life. None of his films were ever regarded as something good, not even good or passable. They were regarded as trash. And then years later, Tim Burton makes the biopic on Ed Wood. And now people like me, people who went to film school, inspired by people like Ed Wood, celebrate Ed Wood. So even years, decades, generations, and maybe even some cases centuries after you're gone, you can be praised by a whole generation of people. And something also that's interesting about this story, I did meet Tim Burton, or at least I saw Tim Burton once in my lifetime, and I was a very young child. And it might be weird. You might be saying, how were you aware of Tim Burton as a young kid? Well, I had much older brothers. So even though I was like only 5 years old, I remember seeing Beetlejuice in the theater. Pee-wee's Big Adventure was one of my favorite films. And then I remember standing in line to buy my ticket to see Batman in the summer of 1990. So in 1994, when Ed Wood came out, I was very much aware of Ed Wood, of Tim Burton. But in 1992, this would have been 1 year before the Nightmare Before Christmas was released, I was about 10 miles that way in a department store in a plaza that no longer exists. And I was walking around and I'm like, wow, that looks like Pee Wee Herman. That looks like the principal from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And that looks like Tim Burton. But as a kid, didn't think much of it. Even if I actually thought it really was them in real life, I just moved on. But my brother worked at a video store. Again, my brother's 11 years my senior, so he was working at a video rental store that was a couple doors down. And by the time my parents dropped me off at home, my brother had called the phone and left on the answering machine. Remember those with the tapes? Answering machine, saying that he just saw Tim Burton, Jeffrey Jones, and Paul Rubens, aka Pee Wee Herman, come out of that department store. Why were they here? Why were they close to Poughkeepsie, New York? Well, because they were researching Ed Wood. They came to his hometown. They wanted to see the Bardavon. They wanted to see his childhood home. They wanted to visit local libraries. They wanted to develop, to immerse themselves in the life of Ed Wood as much as they possibly could. And what's kind of interesting about that is Tim Burton fell in love with the area, and he bought a house. That's right, he bought a house in Poughkeepsie. And I don't think it was until early 2000s, 2003, 2002, that I think he moved to Los Angeles, and eventually I think he lives in London now, Tim Burton. But Tim Burton lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, and the whole reason that not the whole reason why he moved here, but what brought Tim Burton to Poughkeepsie, New York, was the research he was doing on the film, the 1994 film, the biopic, Ed Wood. And it just kind of is shocking to think that, wow, I should have walked up to Tim Burton at that department store when I was a kid. But again, there it is, the empty space that once occupied, or that space where Ed Wood's house once occupied. And then down this street, 1 block, 3 blocks that way, I'm gonna make an edited video. I just wanted to do an edited video of this before Halloween, and it's totally not gonna happen. So I'm like, you know what? I gotta go do a live and at least give you guys a sneak peek. So I will do an edited video of this material one day. I'll take you to the Bardavon. We'll go inside the Bardavon. I have spoken with the gentleman who puts on the non-for-profit shows, performances. They play old films there all the time. I've spoken with the gentleman who puts on all this stuff, and he said he'd be more than happy to have this channel or myself come in and take a look around, go backstage, maybe see the dressing room where Bela Lugosi would have been putting on his Dracula makeup and getting into costume. but also where Tim Burton would have seen all of the films as a child that inspired him to become a filmmaker. So there it is. One more look. I have to say, I grew up not too far away from here. I don't even live too far away from here now. I just happened to be filming something in Poughkeepsie today, and the day was running short of sunlight hours. And I'm like, you know what? I can't finish the video. Let me come out and do a live of the Ed Wood house. I never saw it with my eyes. But if you do a Google Maps search, just do a little bit of Google Ed Wood address, Franklin Avenue in Poughkeepsie. I'm not sure what the exact address is. 116 is across the street. But the picture of the abandoned house before it was tore down, I think, is still there. But unfortunately, when I moved back in 2016, demolished. Parking lots. So in the comments below, let me know what you think of Tim Burton's Ed Wood, or if you have seen a selection of Ed Wood's films. Anything from, you know, like Glenn or Glenda, you know, something that's blatantly not horror, or something like Plan 9 from Outer Space that's horror but more science fiction, or something that's more like blatantly horror like Bride of the Monster. What is your favorite Ed Wood film? And if this were a museum, these are all questions that you can talk about. If this were a museum, would you come and visit, pay a visit? Or maybe they could have turned it to a bed and breakfast. Would you stay at the Ed Wood Childhood Home bed and breakfast? That's gonna be it for me today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this little on-site, cinematic, Halloween-ish themed video. I will be doing an edited video, like I said, on this topic at a later point, but it was never gonna happen before October 31st. So I wanted to go ahead and do this live now and share with you this little piece of history. Thank you for joining, everyone. Make sure to hit that thumbs up button. If you are not subscribed, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the notification button so you don't miss any of these spontaneous live videos. I will be seeing you folks soon, but until then, be good and happy Halloween. Bye-bye, guys.